Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can find and subscribe to this podcast via Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our site, vmspod.com, to find more information, as well as our RSS feed, which you can plug into any podcatcher so you never miss an episode of the Virtual Memories Show. You can also follow me on Blue Sky, Instagram, and YouTube, where I go by vmspod, and subscribe to my semi-weekly newsletter at buttondown.com/vmspod. It's time for our 13th annual guest list episode. For the guest list, I asked 2025's podcast guests to tell us about the favorite book they read in the past year. Didn't have to be something published in 2025, just something they read and loved. Also, some of them told me about which books or authors they hope to read in 2026. Now, I'll also provide mine at the end. It will not be comprehensive. If I missed your book, I'm very sorry, but that's where we are. Now, Hanukkah's already done, and Christmas is just a couple days away as I'm recording this, but, you know, I'm always in a gift-giving vibe when it comes to sharing the gift of books. So, also, I'll say to all you listeners, I hope you read some good stuff last year. I hope you find some good books to read in the year to come. And, let me know what you're reading. Let me know what you like. That's how I get turned on to good stuff. Now, more than 24 guests from 2025 responded to this year's invite. I don't give too much of an intro to each one, so I hope you will look up the episode and its roster in our website. It's at chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com. And you'll find a link to the guest list 2025. And that has links to just about all the books or authors that we mentioned this time around, as well as a link to each of our participants' episodes. So you can go back and listen to what they had to share with us. And while you're there, you can also find all the past editions of the guest list going back to 2013, which is a long time now. And like I say, I will tell you about my favorite reads from 2025 and my 2026 aspirations at the end. So let's get started. Now, our first guest is David Shields, who was on last March to talk about the documentary How We Got Here and the companion book, How We Got Here, Melville plus Nietzsche divided by the square root of Alan Bloom times Zizek squared equals Bannon. This is all longer than his actual thing, but David writes, "This past year, I've obsessively been reading and rereading Todd McGowan's work. Right now, I'm rereading for the nth time McGowan's Emancipation After Hegel, Achieving a Contradictory Revolution." No 2026 recommendations or aspirations, but that's fine. Mia Wolf, the artist who made The Empty Lot and recently put out Lost and Found, both from Fantagraphics, told me that Everything Will Swallow You by Tom Cox was high on her list. Paul Karasik is up next. Earlier this year, Paul published the 30 Years in the Making graphic adaptation of Paul Auster's New York trilogy, with comics by him, David Mazzucchelli, and Lorenzo Mattotti, another past guest. Paul writes, "Over the past 2 years, about 6 people recommended Tove Jansson's The Summer book to me. I finally read it, and I can see why they thought I would like it. I loved it." Next up, Gogol. Another book that keeps getting recommended to me is Dead Souls. Our next guest is Virtual Memories regular Dmitry Samarov, who's been publishing a series of public domain novels with his own illustrations, like Moby Dick, Winesburg, Ohio, and The Suicide's Grave. Dmitry writes, "Daybook by Nathan Knapp is a kind of confession in book form. Written like a diary and touching on the writer's grappling with faith, relationship, and family challenges and sexuality, this is one of the more intimate and immediate novels I've read in recent memory. Service by John Tottenham is a laugh-out-loud cry for help from a writer trapped behind a cash register. He drops a bunch of barely disguised names, but this is no Starfuckers tour of L.A., Behind the overwrought frustrations and bad behavior of his protagonist, there's a very honest examination of the hard realities of attempting self-expression under the current economic system in this country. For 2026, he writes, I may try Ulysses again. I have a beautiful oversized edition illustrated by Eduardo Arroyo. I've never gotten through this one. I need to find some more public domain titles to refurbish and illustrate too, thinking Tristram Shandy or Melville's The Confidence Man. Whatever it will be involves reading and rereading, possibly audiobook versions on top of that too. Peter Stoddard is up next. We had a great conversation about his new bio of Horace called Poet on a Volcano, which I just loved. He writes, when I first heard Donald Trump threatening to welcome Greenland into the United States, I went back to Peter Hoag's eerie Danish novel, Miss Smilla's Feeling for Snow. This is Gil. I think that was Smilla's Sense of Snow when it came out in the U.S. Anyway, he writes, I'd read it in my first year of editing the Times of London in 1992. In those innocent days, when rare earth was a phrase not even heard rarely, this unusual critique of empire and greed caused quite a stir. It was anti-colonialism on ice, and on the snow, which Miss Smilla can read for criminality in ways that others cannot. She was maybe the first heroine of what became Scandi Noir. We haven't heard much since then about the president's Greenland plans. If they too are on ice, that would surely be a mercy. My reading ambitions for 2026 are contrastingly warm. The stories of the Sicilian writer Giovanni Verga. As an idealistic teenager, I was thrilled by La Roba, which came out in 1883. A radical, but not at all predictable, critique of property given to me by my Latin teacher, whose wife taught Italian on the side. This is going to be the year when my Italian is restored at least to the level of 60 years ago. Verga, a master of now unfashionable realism, is going to be my guide. Jonathan Ames, author of the Happy Doll series of crime novels, is up next. He writes, off the top of my head, my favorite books of 2025 are Cockfighter by Charles Willeford, several different translations of the Tao Te Ching, including one by Ursula K. Le Guin, and The Heart of Meditation by the Dalai Lama. And he says, I'm looking forward to reading How to Live and Die by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Cecile Wajsbrot is next. She wrote an absolutely amazing novel called Nevermore, which was translated by past guest Tess Lewis. I might go on about that at the end. I might not have time. We'll see. Cecile writes, let's say you're a young woman in search of rare books. Let's say you're having breakfast at your hotel and someone near you drops a piece of bread. Let's say it is the 18th of November. The same scene happens the following day. And then you notice it is still the 18th of November. This is how On the Calculation of Volume begins. Solveig Ball, the author, lives on a Danish island, an appropriate location to write about the Isle of Time, where Tara Salter, the novel's main character, remains stuck. 6 books are already published in Denmark, and the author is presently working on the 7th and last one. 4 have already been translated in English. You can read it like a thriller, like a philosophical meditation over time, over ecology, like a science fiction novel. It is all that and much more. A captivating journey through the metaphysics of our present times. Solveig Ball, On the Calculation of Volume, is translated by Barbara J. Haviland and published by New Directions. Next year, I would like to discover a great classical or contemporary literary work that I'm not yet aware of, and of course, to keep reading the following calculation volumes. Our next guest is the cartoonist Kayla E., cartoonist and graphic designer Kayla E., whose debut graphic novel, Precious Rubbish, is an absolute wonder. If you've listened to the show since I recorded with her this fall, you'll know that our conversation was, we'll say, meaningful for me. Anyway, Kayla writes, 2025 faves, Mysticism by Simon Critchley. I take credit for that one, by the way. I suggested it during our podcast in September. So anyway, Mysticism by Simon Critchley, The Book of Miracles by Joshua P. Waterman and Till Holger Borchardt, Jesus as Mother by Caroline Walker Bynum, and The Lexicon of Kamakana by Mort Walker. That's I think 1970s collection of, this is me speaking, of, well, the language of comics and all the little things that go into cartoons and comic strips, visual elements, what they mean, etc. Anyway, it came out from New York Review of Books. It's by Mort Walker, the Beetle Bailey guy. It is an absolute joy. Anyway, for 2026, Kayla says, I'm going to read 4 books by Caroline Walker Bynum: Wonderful Blood, Holy Feast and Holy Fast, Metamorphosis and Identity, and Last Things, Death and Apocalypse. Plus, she says, Powers of Horror, an essay on abjection by Julia Kristeva, Nuns as Artists by Jeffrey P. Hamburger, the English text of the Ancrene Rule, Ancrene Riwle. We'll go with that. There'll be a link to this in the show notes, don't worry. And The New Herbal by Leonard Fuchs. Now, here's our first audio submission from Sasha Mardu, whose book about therapy, past tense, reached me at the right time.
Hey, Gil, this is Sasha Mardu. I'm coming to you from a snow day in St. Louis. It's pretty bleak out with a white sky and trees covered in snow. It's kind of pretty, but it's a good day to stay indoors and read for sure. Let's talk about a few of my favorite books from this year. I really loved Ian McEwan's What We Can Know, which is a novel set 100 years in the future when global warming has turned Britain into a series of archipelagos. And there's these humanities scholars who are basically digging into our now, the 2015s, the 2020s. It's such a good novel, really unexpected. It turns into a sort of literary mystery, and it's incredibly satisfying and cool. So I love that. I also really enjoyed Alison Bechdel's Spent, which was very funny and unexpected. And the book I'm most looking forward to is The Wait by Melissa Mendez. It's on my Christmas list, so I can't wait to read it. I've already read parts of the mini comic and just loved it. So I hope you have a safe and bright winter's break and take care.
Political cartoonist Tom Tomorrow is up next. You ought to subscribe to Sparky's List, his weekly newsletter at thismodernworld.com. That has that week's comic strip as well as some commentary and other interesting stuff from Tom Tomorrow. He writes, I ended up rereading a lot of old favorites because I'm perpetually running out to catch a subway somewhere and remembering at the last minute that I need to grab something to read. Those included Tom DeHaven's truly wonderful It's Superman, along with the first several books in the Arkady Renko series, as well as the last one Martin Cruz Smith wrote before his death, Hotel Ukraine. As I understand it, Smith had to relearn how to write when Parkinson's robbed him of the ability to type, and he began to dictate his books, but I think he found his groove again with Hotel Ukraine. It wasn't quite at the level of his earlier work, but I found it a satisfying farewell to characters I've been following for many decades. Also, The Doorman by Chris Pavone. That was a fun social satire / murder mystery set in a high-end doorman building on Central Park West. In speculative fiction, I read the new one from John Scalzi this year, The Shattering Peace. Unpublished manuscripts from my friends Richard Kadrey and Charles Stroth, a new Sandman Slim from the former, and the last in the Laundry series from the latter. Plus The Ministry of Time by Kellyanne Bradley and Lessons in Magic and Disaster by Charlie Jane Anders. I was doing some interviews for a small series at a bistro bookstore in the West Village called Sula Luna, which is run by friends of mine, and in the course of preparing for those, I read Peter Cooper's Insectopia, Molly Crabapple's Drawing Blood, and Vika Lamasco's The Last Soviet Artist. In nonfiction, I read Owned by Ian Higgins, Careless People by Sarah Wynne Williams, and Ludicrous by Edward Niedermeyer. All books, one way or another, about how we got to the place where we're going. Finally, I spent a lot of time reading and rereading 5 years' worth of my own cartoons in the process of putting together my next book, which I recently kickstarted. Does that count? It in fact does. Dan Perkins / Tom Tomorrow and I did a podcast when he was doing the Kickstarter for Our Long National Nightmare, which collects 5 years worth of This Modern World. Just got my copy a couple of days ago. It's wonderful. Now, Lance Richardson's biography of Peter Matheson, True Nature, is one of my faves from this year and one that I think will stick with me for many years after this. Here's what Lance had to say. In 2025, when it comes to nonfiction, my favorite read was How to End a Story, the collected diaries of Helen Garner, which I reviewed for the Washington Post. I'd actually read this book before when it was published as 3 volumes in Australia, but it was re-released as a single book in 2025, so I think it counts. It's an astounding book, full of startling observations about marriage, aging, the craft of writing, even the shape of clouds. I loved every page. As for fiction, it was Shadow Ticket by Thomas Pynchon. I have to admit I'd never read a Pynchon novel before, and was skeptical because much of the Pynchon fandom seems kind of cultish. But I gave this title a shot and found it bizarre and enchanting. It hit all the right spots and hooked me utterly. I went straight from Shadow Ticket to The Crying a Lot 49, then on to Mason and Dixon, so I guess I'm part of the cult now. For 2026, I plan to work my way through the rest of Pynchon's catalog, starting with Inherent Vice and probably leaving Gravity's Rainbow till the end. I feel like I may have to work up to it. There are also a few 2026 galleys on my bedside table. Dan Chiasson's Bernie for Burlington, which comes out in February, is high on the pile. I will suggest, this is Gil again, if you're going through Pynchon, Gravity's Rainbow might seem to be the terminal point, but actually Against the Day, his 1,200-page book from the early 2000s, I consider to be, I won't say greater, but maybe a greater distillation of Pynchon and everything he's getting after. The fact that it's 1,200 pages means maybe it's not a distillation, maybe it's an expansion of everything. Anyway, Lance, if you're listening to this one, maybe save Against the Day until the end. Next up is last week's guest, Jonathan Sandler, who keeps a great comics blog at graphicmemoir.co.uk.
Hi, Gil. It's Jonathan Sandler. Thanks again for having me on the show this year. It was truly one of the highlights of the year was recording with you in London back in November. In terms of my favourite reads for 2025, there were 2 graphic novels that stayed with me. For many reasons. One was Victory Point by Owen Pomeroy, published by Avery Hill. And the second one was A Journal of My Father by Jiro Taniguchi. So I first encountered Pomeroy on Instagram, where his striking architectural illustrations caught my eye. His clear line style is a little bit reminiscent of Hergé or perhaps Nick Donasso. And Pomeroy has also appeared in The New Yorker. Victory Point is a great little book where the town becomes the character in its own right. It's also a book about someone coming home. And that theme is also, interestingly, in the book A Journal of My Father by Jiro Taniguchi. I started to learn about Taniguchi last summer when I visited the Mangasia exhibition in Santa Ana, California. I was captivated by his depictions of everyday life, and I then bought A Journal of My Father. It's a story about Yoichi, who attends his estranged father's funeral, and he confronts his past and uncovers layers of misunderstanding and regret. So both stories show how returning to familiar places can evoke nostalgia, reflection, and unresolved emotions. If you haven't read them yet, I highly recommend both. Thanks again, Gil, for a fabulous year of the Virtual Memory Show, and we look forward to listening to many great conversations in 2026. Happy holidays.
And here's another audio submission from Seth Lorenci, who I've recorded with last winter for his book Death Trip.
Hey, Seth Lorenci here, by the way. Thanks so much for asking for my book list. Frankly, I think not enough people ask me for my opinion, so I'm touched and flattered. I just have a few books to share. The first one is called Wolf Bells. It's by a Portland author named Lainey Zumas, who, like me, is from Washington, D.C. We sort of brushed elbows there, barely, through the music scene. A few years ago, Lainey wrote a book called Red Clocks, which I'm pretty sure was a New York Times bestseller. it's speculative fiction about a United States in which Roe v. Wade has been overturned, if you can believe such a thing. This book, Wolf Bells, is quieter and smaller in a way, but no less good. It centers around, I think the best way I can describe it is an intergenerational punk house. It's a dwelling on the Oregon coast designed to take care of elderly, but also just sort of misfits of every stripe. And it's dark and mordant and very funny and just touching. It just sort of, it's these sort of thumbnail sketches of people who are underserved by the mainstream, the elderly, the neurodivergent, queer people of every stripe. And I loved it. Then there is Night of the Gun, which is not new. I think it's like a decade old or so. I found it on a friend's bookshelf, but I've been looking for it for years. Obviously not looking too hard because it's readily available. It also has a DC connection. It's by David Carr, who edited the Washington City Paper for a while, I think right around the time I left DC in 95. But it is memoir, and it is a very, it's basically his descent into full-blown addiction and outrageously bad behavior. But it takes a really sort of rigorous journalistic eye to his worst moments. I mean, he's going back to people he knew with a video recorder and a microphone, basically saying, tell me what happened. I want to understand it on a clinical level. And that sounds kind of cold and distant, but it's actually the opposite. It's really, it's tender and it's probing, and it's, again, like Wolf Bells, it's funny and dark. I really loved it. It was a really unique take on memoir. And then finally, another Portland author, a woman named Lisa Wells. She's mainly a poet, is my understanding, but she wrote a book of nonfiction, came out in early pandemic, poor timing, called Believers. It's such a good book. She's basically sort of wandering the country as a former punk like me, or current or future punk. And she's looking at ways that people like her are sort of observing the disintegration of society and the climatological collapse and trying to forge something new and inventive. And it touches on all these truly strange communities. Like the book opens with these sort of itinerant seed savers who roam the backwoods of the American West, planting natives and replanting native species, these sort of outlaw farmers. And like all the books I love, it was strange and it was touching, and it really stuck with me. I can't recommend it highly enough. Okay, that's enough for now. Again, I appreciate being asked. Thank you for your beautiful work on this podcast. I really, really love it. And hoping the end of the year is good for you and all your listeners. Okay, bye-bye.
Artist, writer, type designer, every damn thing else, etc. Ryan Hughes is up next. He writes, 2025, a 2-volume ring binder set of photo setting fonts from a defunct 1970s company called Alphabet was tops for me. It's full of those crazy decorative faces that were popular just before the advent of the Mac and the proliferation of early computer effects. I'm sure it'll provide inspiration for some of my own designs. Did I mention that I'm a type nerd? For 2026, I have a huge pile of unread books I hope to tackle, but as always, I have a very limited amount of downtime. Nothing in particular jumps to the top of the pile, so I'll be listening to others' recommendations. Ari Richter, author of Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz, left a voicemail on my Google Voice number. There's plenty here, but the audio is a little muffled.
Hi, Gil. This is Ari Richter. I had a great reading year, including a couple books by guests of this show. Precious Rubbish by Kayla E. and Crumb by Dan Nadel were both among the top of my list. Tessa Holt's Pulitzer Prize-winning 2024 graphic memoir Feeding Ghosts was definitely worth the hype, and I learned a lot from Bridget Reed's Little Bosses Everywhere, How the Pyramid Scheme Shaped America. Lastly, I would be remiss not to mention my wife Erin Carmone's beautifully written and deeply reported new book, Unbearable, 5 Women and the Perils of Pregnancy in America. If you have a uterus in the USA or love someone who does, it should be required reading. And I think they should make all men in Congress read it too, for good measure. In terms of 2026 reads, my list is topped by Volume 5 of French-Syrian cartoonist Riyad Sattouf's graphic memoir, The Arab of the Future. I fell in love with the first 4 volumes of the series and was heartbroken when I learned that the original English-language publisher would not be releasing translations of the final 2 books. I thought maybe I'd need to learn French to find out how the story ends. But, needless to say, I was elated to learn that Fantagraphics will be publishing volumes 5 and 6, with the first one coming out in May. Magnifique. All right, thanks a lot. Have a great year. Bye.
If you couldn't hear all those, don't worry. All of Ari's recommendations and aspirations are up on the webpage for this episode. Now, Jennifer Hayden chimed in next. I really enjoyed her new memoir, Where There's Smoke, There's Dinner.
Hi, Gail. Jennifer Hayden here, checking in on the favorite book reading and want to read list. So what's the favorite book I read in 2025? That would be pretty hard to choose, but I think the one I enjoyed the most, partly because it went on the longest, was The World She Edited by Amy Redding, about Catherine White and the New Yorker and E.B. White. And it's about so many incredible writers and an incredible place where writing flourished, and it explains a lot of the mystique of the New Yorker, which is quite deliberate. And that was really fun to see them create as part of the magazine. I also discovered Niall Williams this year, and he was just amazing. He's a gorgeous Irish writer. And I also did really enjoy The Paris Express by Emma Donoghue. She's long been a very favorite writer of mine. I like the Irish writers, you can see. So, and then for what I want to read in 2026, the next one on my stack, and it's absolutely seething as it sits there, is Bread of Angels by Patti Smith. I can't wait to read that. And then Liz Gilbert has a new book out, what is it called? Something to the River. And that one I really look forward to reading. I haven't read Liz Gilbert in a long time. So there's a lot of good stuff out there, and I'm enjoying it. Keeps the winter warm. So have a good time with your books, and see you later. Bye.
That Elizabeth Gilbert book is All the Way to the River. Josh Neufeld is up next. His A.D., New Orleans After the Deluge, has gained new prominence with the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina last fall and the dismantling of FEMA and every other federal response to potential catastrophes. Anyway, Josh writes, my favorite quote-unquote book I've read in 2025 is one I'm still reading. Jake Halpern and Michael Sloan's Separation, a 6-part work of comics journalism which is running in the New York Times. So far, there have been 2 chapters. It follows the story of a real-life, undocumented Honduran family as they navigate the perilous, brave new Trumpian world of immigration, political asylum, birthright citizenship / deportation. The tale is mostly told through the voice of Mateo, the eldest son, as the family has to flee their home in one quote-unquote outer borough and relocate to a relative's home in the Bronx. And who knows what further travails lie ahead. Like all good works of comics journalism, Separation brings to visceral life the experiences of these people who are leading really different lives from that of many readers. For each person in the family, a different possible fate awaits, pretty much guaranteeing that separation lies in their future. Separation is being reported and written by Halpern and illustrated by Sloan, and it's told in bite-sized panels which have been optimized to read on your phone, so sometimes it can seem a bit awkward in presentation when it's read in print or on the New York Times website, but once you adjust to the format, it's really engaging. Sloan's artwork is cartoony but detailed, and the characters have a real humanity to them. The inking is strong and confident, and the comic is shaded in a simple palette of blues. Many panels have a lot of text, but Sloane's lettering is readable and attractive, and he always figures out how to balance the text well with the comic's overall design. By the way, if you recognize Halpern and Sloane's names, it's because they won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for their comics journalism piece, Welcome to the New World, about the immigration journey of a Syrian refugee family. I await each new chapter of Separation with great anticipation. Peter Trachtenberg's The Twilight of Bohemia was one of my favorite podcast books from this year. Peter writes, "Of the books I read in 2025, the standouts are I Heard Her Call My Name, Lucy Sant's elegantly structured memoir of transition. I ordinarily think of a successful memoir as one that takes on a discrete period in the writer's life, but Sant organizes hers around the theme of her transition while allowing herself to range through all the years that preceded it to find the seeds and precursors of the woman she was waiting to become. Cynthia Carr's biography of Candy Darling is inspiring, hilarious, and heartbreaking, and deeply nostalgic for anyone who even dipped their toes into the swift black current of downtown New York City in the 1970s. Of my fiction picks, Shadows on the Hudson is also set in New York, but the Jewish New York of the early 1950s. It's Isaac Bashevis Singer's last posthumously published novel, originally serialized in The Forward in 1957. It's basically a soap opera or telenovela, a riot of adultery, marriages of convenience and inconvenience, philosophy and theology, lent gravity by the fact that many of the characters are mourning spouses or children murdered in the death camps. It's overwritten and colored by Singer's Hamish misogyny and his horror of secular culture. One character broods that the whole of American civilization is an quote-unquote underworld. But it's irresistible, especially the audiobook read by Theodore Bickel, Julie Harris, and John Rubinstein. How irresistible? I don't even like audiobooks, and I'm listening to this one for the second time. Gina Apostol's Insurrecto is one of those nested box novels, a less successful precursor is Rick Moody's The Diviners, set in the Philippines under the homicidal rule of Rodrigo Duterte, involving a Filipina translator's enlistment in the crew of an American film about a massacre perpetrated by American troops in 1901. Around this historical atrocity, Apostol erects a hall of mirrors with rival screenplays, exuberant multilingual punning, and karaoke. Its history as nightmare and farce at the same time. Peter writes, I have no idea if I'll live through 2026, let alone what I'll read in it. The Anarchist Cookbook may be worth a second read, or some Stefan Zweig. Now, David Leopold, archivist of Al Hirschfeld and overseer of the recent Hirschfeld-Sondheim poster book, sent a message.
It has been a very crazy book year for me this year. I was out promoting a book, Hirschfeld-Sondheim, which I'm happy to report made the USA Today bestseller list. And I finished another one that comes out in April called Hirschfeld's Icons. So those took a lot of time. One of the books I read to do the Sondheim book was Sondheim's Finishing the Hat. And look, I made a hat. And these were fascinating annotated lyric books that really revealed a great deal about Sondheim to me after someone who has known his work. To hear him talk about it and write about it was quite an experience. But I suppose the favorite books I read this year, one was The Silver Snarling Trumpet by Robert Hunter, which is this fascinating memoir of his early life, you know, when he was 20, 21, 22 years old in Palo Alto, and hanging out with Jerry Garcia and Alan Trist and essentially the brain trust that would become the Grateful Dead. And it's a book that he wrote at the time and then put away, and it was just published. And it's fascinating how much he really captured there. I just finished reading Photographic Memory, William Henry Jackson and the American West, a wonderful graphic novel by Bill Griffith. And I had no idea the two were related or that he is even named for him. And I found it a really great book. And then something I reread every couple of years, maybe every 10 years or so. When it's so hard to read the news now, I find myself reading books more. And one thing that made me smile often this year was the collected works of Saki. I've always loved these stories, and they never fail to make me laugh. I'm sure as an individual, he might have been a complicated person, but the stories are wonderful. The books that I'm looking forward to reading, I've never read Sapiens, which everyone tells me is wonderful, most of all my wife, so I really feel that I need to make that a reality. I'm also looking forward to reading Mothership Connected, which is a story of the women in Parliament Funkadelic. I think that'll be a fascinating study of that world. I am also going to read Ben West's scholarly study of the American musical, because he is a real new voice in theater history, and his story of the American musical is much richer and more complete than most people who have done it before. He includes everybody rather than just white men. The two other books that I'm looking forward to reading is Van Gogh and the End of Nature, by Michael Lobel. We think of Van Gogh as the great nature painter, but he actually incorporated a lot of industrial scenes in his work, and a lot of his work may have been influenced by the particles in the air around him. I'm really looking forward to that. And then finally, I'm looking forward to reading Blotter, The Untold Story of an Acid Medium. Because I have personal experience, and I love reading histories that you can't find any other place. So these aren't books I might recommend to other people, but they will be the ones that I like to read. And I'll look forward to hearing about new books on your show all year. Bye-bye.
On the other hand, Kate Maruyama, author of the novel Alterations, wrote, "I so prefer hearing your voice to my own. So here you go. I absolutely gobbled up Death of an Author by Nnedi Okorafor. Her rich language and characterization, mixed with the right amount of family petty, made it an absorbing read. Sundown in San Ajuelo by M.M. Olivas is an existential, creepy, and wonderful horror novel, and I adored Lilian Rivera's creepy, tiny threads. I'm reading Percival Everett's James now, which is making my geek self really happy, as I'm a student of Huckleberry Finn, good and bad. My to-be-read list is already tall for 2026, with work from Sherry L. Smith, Charlie Jane Anders, and Miriam Gerba topping the stack. I want to dig into a few collections as I'm putting one together, and a few more novellas as I'm working on a craft book on writing novellas with L.P. Kindred. And whatever else comes along to surprise me. I try to read like a greedy 12-year-old in front of the library shelf, surprised and delighted by whatever comes next. Glenn Kurtz is our next guest. I really dug Glenn's book, Men at Work, about the guys who built the Empire State Building. His favorites of 2025, Solveig Ball on the Calculation of Volume, Volumes 1 and 2. Like so many people, I was entranced by On the Calculation of Volume. I love the first book, its hallucinatory realism and how it explored how gaps grow in a relationship, as much as a conceit of being caught in the same day. I did feel it lagged a touch in the middle. And, like everyone who read it, I wondered how Ball could keep it going over multiple books. It's a sensitive exploration of the perennial, especially middle-aged problem. What do you do with your life? Also, Dino Bugate's The Stronghold, another in the collapse of empire / coming of fascism masterpieces on the margins of Austria-Hungary, in this case Italy, somehow akin to Musil's Torles and even Roth's Radetzky March. Virginia Woolf's Diaries, 1925 to 1930, one of my lifetime favorite authors, Glenn writes, who knew she could be so catty while also being so insightful about character? Maybe the two aren't so far apart. Made me take a serious critical look at my own diary / journal. Next, Jan Fosse's Septology. Honestly, he writes, I found it slow going. The repetitions more repetitious than I wanted, though maybe I lacked the instinct for prayer that motivates it. But the spell it casts, when it casts it, that was profound. And finally, Louise Gluck, American Originality, Essays on Poetry. I've started a project to read poets' essays about poetry. I think this moment in American history needs poetry more than ever, maybe more than anything else. It's the antithesis of everything wrong with the country, maybe the antidote. Also, Mary Oliver, Rules for the Dance, and Edward Hirsch, The Heart of American Poetry. 2026 aspirations, Solveig Ball on the calculation of volume 3, and presumably volume 4 when that comes out. William Blake poems. He writes, for years I've been waiting for the time when I could really sink into Blake's visions and study them. Maybe this will be the year. And Virginia Woolf, more diaries and essays, and rereading The Waves. Dean Haspiel chimed in next.
Hey, Gil, it's Dean Haspiel here, writer, cartoonist, playwright, with, aspirations for writing movies and directing as well. I am morbidly embarrassed to admit that I barely read a book in 2025. I think a lot of us were consumed and obsessed with the news and also trying to make ends meet, as creators and artists and navigating, authenticity with AI and everything else. So I blame that a little bit. I did go see a bunch of theater. I did watch, some movies and television shows. So, I'm a lover of story, right? But I am embarrassed to admit that I don't think I read one novel. And I buy novels. I love writers. I love reading. Again, I think I was, distracted by a lot of what's going on in the world these days. So I will blame it a little bit on that. However, I'm a comic book guy. So I did read a bunch of comic books. I read The Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Batman and Robin, World's Finest, and Eric Larson's Savage Dragon. So I did, keep up a little bit with, stories that I've been reading since I was 12 years old, and I'm 58 now. Some of the graphic novels I got that I did not read this year were Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips' The Knives, Houses of the Holy, Daniel Cloud's Monica, Jaime Hernandez's Life Drawing, Rick Parker's Drafted, Bob Fingerman's Printopia. These are books I had meant to read in 2025. So if you're asking what I'm reading in 2026, I'm definitely going to be reading those, including The Veracity Trap by Chip Kidd and Michael Cho, and our good pal Dan Goleman's Red Light Properties. The one graphic novel that I did read that, I had been putting off for a while, and it came out a few years ago, was Did You Hear What Eddie Gein Done? By Harold Schechter and Eric Powell. Speaking of obsessions, I've been obsessed with Ed Gein's story for eons. Ever since I was, I first encountered, Psycho or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, that have basically used Ed Gein's, character, as it were, to try to explore what this man had done. And I don't want to give too much away for people who don't know Ed Gein, but if you're into a person who was socially innovative, is the way I'll put it, please check out Did You Hear What Eddie Gein Done? A graphic novel published by Albatross. It's really well done. It's morbid and mesmerizing, and will keep you thinking.
Dean's studio mate, Whitney Matheson, is up next. You should check out her latest collection of short fiction, The Feeling.
Hello, Gil Roth. Hello, Virtual Memories audience. This is Whitney Matheson. Thank you, first of all, for having me on your wonderful podcast this year. What a highlight. But I'm going to try to talk kind of fast because what a great year for reading I had. I also, at the beginning of the year, decided, okay, I'm going to read more. I'm going to read things I love. If I don't love it, I'm going to put it away. Yes, I abandoned books. I will not tell you publicly what those are, but Gil, call me later. I'll tell you what books I hated this year because there were a few of them. But let's talk about the ones I loved. Let's start with nonfiction. A lot of great memoirs this year. I loved Cameron Crowe's The Uncool. Great music writing. Loved Patti Smith's Dream of Angels. More great music writing. However, those two writers could not be more different. So satisfying. Honestly, the end of Cameron Crowe's memoir, I burst into tears. But I was very moved by Patti's as well. She's still revealing things after all these years. I loved Ione Skye's memoir related. That Say Everything. She really does. What a life she's lived. I loved Putting Myself Together, the book of writing by Jamaica Kincaid from the New Yorker. Oh my gosh, I do love the way she puts words together. I loved, my favorite memoir of the year was Sally Mann's artwork, and incredible that she has put out two stunning memoirs. Her previous book, Hold Still, memoir of her work as a photographer, but also just how she has managed to raise this family and stay out of big cities and make great art. Okay, now I'm talking fiction. Let's talk real quick. I loved The Safe Keep, which came out last year, but I read it this year because I wanted a cheaper paperback, so that's what I did. It's great. Loved it. Yael van der Wooten is the author of The Safe Keep. I loved Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, Hot Summer Read. Vampires aren't usually my thing, but they were with this one. Oh, it's sexy. You got centuries of sex and fangs. What more can you ask for? Love on the Calculation of Volume series. Book 3 came out recently, and I mean, this, if you don't know it, Gil, are you reading this? Everybody should read it. I'm fascinated. It's the woman who relives the same day, November 18th, over and over and over, not just for weeks, not just for months, but for years on end. And it's a 7-volume series, and the next volume comes out in April. So I'm already pumped about that. My favorite graphic novel was Mimi Pond's Do Admit, The Mitford Sisters and Me. Didn't know much about the Mitford Sisters. This is such a massive accomplishment research-wise. Artistically, I think maybe it's my favorite thing she's ever done, and I've loved a lot of things Mimi Pond has done, and I even read her stuff when I was a teenager, and she had comics in teen magazines. What else? Those are the big ones that come to mind. I'm almost done reading Heartwood because everybody loves a lady lost in the woods story. So that's a good one. On tap for, you said, what are you going to read? Oh my gosh, I'm talking too long. I'm really going to be fast. On tap, I've got that hulking James Baldwin biography. Love the idea of organizing a life by the loves of your life. So I'm eager to read that. And The Correspondent, I also want to read. Heard so much about that. Minor Black Figures, I also want to read. And Flesh, which, won the Booker Prize. The award winners, before the Oscars, you want to catch up on what are people talking about? What are the award winners? So, yeah, I'll get to those. Anyway, thank you very much. Great books. We love them.
That Patti Smith book is Bread of Angels, not Dream of Angels, but that's okay. Damien Searles, author of The Philosophy of Translation, is up next. Now, when we recorded, that was at the end of 2024, he mentioned to me that his book recommendations tend to be based on the interests of the person who's asking, but he obliged me with this one for you guys. He writes, 6 or 7 years ago, I started saying that Anna Burns's Milkman was my favorite contemporary novel since Bolaño. I've read a lot of good books since then, but nothing new held a candle to Milkman, which is a great book that everyone should read. In early 2025, though, it got dethroned. My vote for the best book of the 20th century so far is now Praiseworthy by Alexis Wright, a Moby Dick for our time, in some ways even better than Melville, by an Aboriginal Australian woman who is my top pick for a Nobel Prize from now until she gets it. The power of the writing, the epic yet family-centered story, the sharp eye on contemporary reality, and the mythic sweep of her vision is really like nothing I've ever seen. But, he writes, it still wasn't my book of the year. That would be David Larson's translation of The Book of Rain, a 9th century Arabic lexicography by Abu Zaid al-Ansari, listing a couple of hundred different words for weather phenomena. Sound dry? Didn't you hear the title? This is the least dry book ever. Larson's effortless utter mastery of, it seems, all of Arabic history and literature, his willingness to make confident value judgments, and his poet's sensibility and craft make his translation and every part of his copious notes an inexhaustible treasure trove of insight and delight. We hear that the milking, the easing, the frisk, and the swelling have the same intensity as the shower, and a footnote tells us that the Arabic for the frisk is related to a verb that, said of a horse, means to caper. Said of a woman, it means to awaken a man's lust by moving her body, which makes Larson's frisky translation of the name of this kind of rain shower perfect. His endnotes are a rich anthology of all sorts of Arabic poetry. We learn in an aside that what English calls columns of information are called after canals in Arabic. We learn that what makes the chuckle a metaphor for lightning is a sudden involuntary showing of bright teeth. His beautiful introduction reminds us that, quote, the contents of the future are the contents of a cloud. In lived experience, rain is an emotional coefficient of all things. To ask whether rain will fall on a given day is a world's least shallow question. This whole book is magnificent, he writes. As for next year, you know who else is really great? John Steinbeck. I read about half of Grapes of Wrath a long time ago, and it was amazing, even though I never finished it. I've read a few other short books of his since, and I'm saving up a bundle of Grapes and Wrath, East of Eden, which I've barely started, and the lesser Tortilla Flat, along with Alexis Wright's earlier novel, Carpentaria, to wallow in sometime soon, hopefully during a long stay somewhere far away from here. Dan Goldman's comic about Miami real estate exorcists, Red Light Properties, is a blast. You ought to check out his big collection from last year and his new strips for the title. Dan says, favorite book read in 2025? Beautyland by Marie-Hélène Bertino. It's been a few months and I'm still thinking about it. I don't want to spoil anything other than to say her writing is stunning, weird, and deeply insightful. Everything I read novels for. Also, the Happy Doll series by Jonathan Ames. I read all 3 of these this year in a rip, something I never do, especially when they're this good, but I lost all self-control. This is my favorite of Ames's work to date. Each book builds on and improves the whole. I hope he keeps writing these forever. And books or authors he hopes to tackle in 2026. The Antidote by Karen Russell. He says, this is the next book I'm digging into. I don't even know what it's about, but she's a perennial favorite writer of mine, and this one is whispering to me from deep inside my Kindle. And Space Oddity by Catherine M. Valente. It's a sequel to my other favorite read of 2025, Space Opera, an ADHD sci-fi romp that could have been one dumb joke that Valente turns into a breathless, nonstop delight. Every page is choked with bonkers sci-fi concepts, terrible jokes that land harder than they should, and I was cheering by the end, wanting more. M.L. Rio, whose novel Hot Wax was one of my 2025 faves, wrote, 2025, the first book I reread this year was Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest, a brilliant and brutal novel, and I'm still thinking about it here at the end of the year. Hammett's uncompromising indictment of plutocratic governance has some unpleasant but unavoidable resonances in 2025. Another favorite this year was Holly Wilson's Kitten Tits, a wonderful and hilarious joyride of a novel with one of the most memorable narrative voices I've encountered in a long time. 2026, she writes, because I have no self-control in a bookstore, last time I stopped to sign stock at the Strand, I walked out with a 700-page biography of Humphrey Bogart, called Bogart by A.M. Sperber and Eric Lax. So I'm going to Bogart that book in 2026, probably as my bedside table reading. Since so much of my job is reading, it's actually rare that I get to read anything purely for pleasure, so I'll savor this one for a good long while. I also bought myself a DVD player for Christmas, and I've got a list of 100 lesser-known noirs to watch for novel research, which is a nice pairing for this. And that is all the 2025 respondents. I want to thank everyone for being part of this, and to all the other guests who helped make 2025 a year full of virtual memories. As far as my faves go, I'll split between podcast reading and extracurricular stuff. I mean, it's what I usually do, but this year some of my top books kind of intertwine. The big one, the big two, I finished The Snow Leopard by Peter Matthiessen in January, and that was an amazing experience. It's about Matheson's trek through Nepal with a naturalist while he's looking for some soul peace in the wake of his wife's death and some other unspoken issues in his life. It's beautiful, and his self-realizations and his descriptions of the mountains and the travels and the interactions with the Sherpas and other folks and the naturalist and everything else. It adds up to an unforgettable book. Also, this is the title that got me to start my funny meditation practice, so I have to give it extra credit for that. So that was non-podcast reading, but it was also sort of podcast reading, because the reason I tackled it was that I was going to be recording with Lance Richardson this year for his biography of Peter Matthiessen, True Nature, which is incredible. That book is absolutely fantastic, and it's one of the best things I've read this year. I think I mentioned it during the episode, either in the conversation or the intro, but when I finished True Nature after 700 or so pages about Mathiessen's life, writing, times, betrayals, and more, I had a grin plastered to my face, because I was so happy that someone could write a book like this, encompassing the life of a literary heavyweight, and I was happy that that sort of life was still out there to be captured. So the combo of The Snow Leopard and True Nature were sort of 1A, 1B among my fave books this year. Now, as other podcast side books go, really dug Martin Mittelmeier's Naples 1925, Adorno, Benjamin, and the Summer That Made Critical Theory, because I never really got into critical theory, never liked it, always found it too difficult. I'm just not smart enough. But this book gave me a new approach to them, while exploring the roots of how they came across their mode and what Naples may have meant to them. And I think the materiality and physicality of that helps give me an entry point into that work and what it means. So Naples 1925, small book from Martin Mittelmeier. I'm really looking forward to his Thomas Mann in Hollywood that, I think is done in German, but don't know if it'll be coming out in English anytime soon. Peter Trachtenberg, who we mentioned earlier when he spoke, his Twilight of Bohemia, Westbeth and the Last Artists of New York, is an absolute joy. I recorded in Westbeth once, this converted Bell Labs building, which is artist residence, opened around the time I was born. An artist lived there relatively inexpensively in New York City, Lower West Side sort of environment. When I recorded there, I knew nothing about this place. I had no idea where I was going, what it was as a concept. Learned about it afterwards, but Peter's history of Westbeth, this whole island of an artist's residence, how the multi-generationality of it kind of screws up what's going on, the ways art progressed and changed, all this is absolutely illuminating. His writing is beautiful, and I saw him at a reading for the book, and he writes to his voice, and he knows how to deliver anecdotes and good stories. I'll put it that way. But the book brings us this world where things could have been different, where the arts mattered, where it was a time where it was important to make sure that artists could afford to live in New York City. And we see how the changing economics of this place have kind of destroyed that. And this shows us, like I said, this alternate world where other streams of art could flourish. So go get The Twilight of Bohemia by Peter Trachtenberg. It's an important book. I also really dug Oliver Radcliffe's memoir, Frighten the Horses. As we talked about on that show, Oliver was my first trans guest, and embarrassingly, it's embarrassing enough I had not had a trans guest before this. Oliver was also the first trans person I'd ever really talked to. So naturally, this is also the first trans memoir that I had read. It is a remarkable book because so much of it is written in the time before he transitions to Oliver. And it's not written from present Oliver's perspective about how much better life is going to get. It is written from her earlier self and the confusion and uncertainty of that. You know, as the reader, this is leading to a better life, but the narration there does not signal it in any way. You are immersed in this experience of dysphoria. It's really a phenomenal piece of life writing about what it means to have two lives, I guess, if that makes sense. I also dug Melting Point, Family, Memory, and the Search for a Promised Land by Rachel Cockerell. That doesn't directly have an author's voice because it is comprised solely of primary texts kind of pieced together to tell this alternate story of Jewish migration and a kind of different form of Zionism. That one impressed the heck out of me. M.L. Rio, who I mentioned earlier, her novel Hot Wax, about a woman who is out to change her life after a weird inheritance from her estranged father. That was an absolute delight. I've never read another novel that so captured the experience of live music the way M.L. does in this one. I don't want to give away too much. The plot is taut. The timelines, the shifts in narration, everything is constructed perfectly. It's a really fantastic novel. It's, I would say go get it. Give it a read. Contemporary, but also flashing back to, an earlier, crazier time for music. Hot Wax by M.L. Rio. Comics, podcast comics. Kayla E.'s Precious Rubbish. Sasha Mardou's Past Tense. They both were very meaningful to me, especially reaching me in the middle of the, we'll be honest here, depression I was going through after my dad's death. They both played roles in, I would say, rebuilding my persona or helping me build the new self I'm turning into. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, Precious Rubbish and Past Tense, Kayla E. and Sasha Mardou. Peter Cooper's Insectopia, that was an absolute masterpiece and a joy to read. Craig Thompson's Ginseng Roots, had no idea what to expect, really manages to tell macro and micro stories in ways that comics maybe don't tend to try nowadays. It felt more ambitious than a lot of things I've read. I'll put it that way. Craig serializing it and then collecting it in about a 500-page book may have something to do with that. But going from his own youth experience, picking ginseng in Wisconsin, to what ginseng means and what the other lives of people involved in that trade meant, it's really, really a fantastic work. There was a lot of other podcast reading. I apologize for not mentioning yours. I love that one just as much as the rest of these. As far as non-podcast stuff goes, the extracurricular reading, as I put it, I was glad that I managed to read both volumes of Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, though Volume 2 does go adrift. Volume 1 leads somewhere. Volume 2 kind of shows why it can never be finished, and never was. But enjoyed the living hell out of it and glad that I made the effort. I read one chapter every morning, and before you know it, 1,100 pages were done like that. I also managed to scale The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, which I started in college and 30 plus years later finally buckled down and read. That complemented my last recorded podcast interview of the year with Morten Høye Jensen and his absolutely fantastic book about the Magic Mountain, The Master of Contradictions. So again, the pod and non-pod reading kind of intertwine. I should have mentioned Morton's book in the pod stuff, but whatever. The Master of Contradictions is really fantastic. It does help to have read The Magic Mountain, but it's a biography of that book and how Thomas Mann changed over the course of writing it. The book that kind of demolished me the most, in a good way, was Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet, translated by Yul Costa. I'll tell you who the translators were for the other books I just mentioned, but you'll find them in the show notes for this one. I don't know how to describe The Book of Disquiet. I knew nothing going in. It is sort of the fragmentary diaries of a couple of Pessoa's heteronyms. That is the personae in which he wrote. He wrote under different names, and those writers each had different personalities and styles. This book is bits and fragments of their writing, his writing, their writing. So there's no real plot. There is a sense, though, of several lived lives that may not be Pessoa's, but the prose itself will just knock you the fuck out. There are just these gorgeous and strange aphorisms and lyrical flights that just annihilated me page after page. I couldn't believe what I was reading sometimes. And I'll return to it for sure. Other books that were important to me. I mentioned my dad dying earlier, and two books that were important to me because of that this year were Roland Barthes' Mourning Diary, Mourning. That's a collection of the scraps of notes he wrote in the wake of his mother's death. The artist Celia Paul gave that to me a couple of years ago, and I returned to it as Dad's health declined and read most of it in the hospital during his final week. I had a very different relationship with my dad than Barth had with his mom, whom he absolutely doted on. But it was very important to me to feel his grief alongside what I was going through. I had a really great experience with Celia maybe a month or two ago when I was in London after a trade show in Frankfurt. We met in her studio, talked for a while, but then we went out to a cafe and we were talking, and I mentioned Julian Sands, the late Julian Sands, who she was friends with, connected with, and this thing happened. This has nothing to do with reading, by the way. I just want to tell you this anecdote because it's about the things that this podcast has opened up my life to. So anyway, we're talking about Julian Sands, and he died while he was hiking in California. And she talked about what a wonderful and beautiful person he was. And she reached in her purse and she pulled out this small crucifix, which belonged to Sands and which his family gave to Celia. And she put it in my hand, and I joked that it was a test to see if I would explode or not, but that did not happen. But it was just this meaningful moment, this token, this emblem of this dead man for whom his faith was incredibly important, and Celia sharing it with me in this cafe was just one of those things that shouldn't happen to some schlub from New Jersey who's a pharmaceutical lobbyist. I'll put it that way. Anyway, it's a moment I haven't really captured for you guys before or for myself, but it meant something. And this is the sort of stuff I ruminate about. Anyway, I mentioned two books that were important to me after Dad's death. The other one, the day right after the funeral, the day after Dad's death, one of my old friends recommended The Invention of Solitude by Paul Auster. That is we'll say memoir, in the first half of it, in which Auster tries to figure out who his recently deceased father really was. It helped me out of my darkness, helped me out of the depression I was in. First, because of the sense that someone else, Auster, had lived through the process of trying to make sense of a cipher of a father after he's gone, but also because my friend saw that this was what I might need. He wasn't just going to recommend a random son writing about a dead father story. He recommended this one because he'd heard stories about my old man and our relationship and realized this might resonate. And that sense of recognition, coupled with the book, really helped me surface. I'll say the second half of The Invention of Solitude did not work as well for me. Auster kind of hides behind his erudition and puts up all these theoretical frameworks about language and all this other stuff. But in the first half, it really feels like the mask is down and that this is a person, not just the writer Paul Auster, who is experiencing grief and doesn't know what he should be doing or feeling. I read a bunch of other stuff during the year, some of which I didn't like, some of which I wasn't ready for in the moment, some of which I was too distracted by the world and my own depression to appreciate. I need to finish up Thomas Pynchon's new novel, Shadow Ticket, which I keep putting down. I think because there's a weird resonance with my old man, who was not a Pynchon reader, don't get me wrong. But I saw the book announcement for Shadow Ticket last spring when I was hanging out in the lobby of an eye surgery clinic where Dad was having his first cataract surgery. Turned out to be his only one. So maybe the weird subconscious peg of Shadow Ticket to one of the last trips around with Dad is kind of keeping me from plunging too deeply into it. I've enjoyed everything I've read so far. I just need to buckle down. So I will return to that once the stress and strain lets up, I guess. As far as my 2025 goals, I'm also, by the way, reading The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. I shit on that book like 20-something years ago, did not like it, even though everything about it was supposed to be right up my alley. I'm giving it another shot because I figure it was probably me, not him. So enjoying it so far. I'm about 170 pages in. I'll let you know how that one goes in this edition next year. But as far as my 2025 goals from last year's guest list, I did actually finish some of the things I'd aspired to. The Snow Leopard and The Man Without Qualities. I got through both of those. I wanted to read Absolution, the fourth Area X / Southern Reach trilogy. I did not get to that, but I did reread the first three books in Area X, Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance. I hope to get to Absolution this year. Also did not read Salman Rushdie's memoir about his attempted murder, Knife. I guess I'm going to put those both back on the list. Not bad, though, since I usually don't get to read a single thing that I aspire to for the following year, which means we need to get to that part now. For 2026, sheesh. As mentioned, I will probably go right back into the Book of Disquiet by Pessoa. Now that I've got some conception of what it is, I'll read it differently. I, too, started on the calculation of volume this fall, like many of our past guests. I will keep that going in 2026. I enjoyed book one. The problem was I was still in kind of the middle of that depression when I read it. And the notion of every day being the same day was sort of what I was living through and not good. So now that I'm now that I've resurfaced, now that horizons seem clearer, I will return to that series, starting with book 2 in the next couple of weeks. I'd also like to read Craig Modd's Things Become Other Things, his book about walking in Japan. Bought that earlier this year, been meaning to get to it. Want to get to The Maze Maker by Michael Ayrton. That's for esoteric reasons. Same with a reread of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And it does not get any more esoteric than reading a new Frank comic from Jim Woodring, so I'm glad to find out there'll be a new one of those this summer. What else? For pod reading, my pal Ali Trotta, her first book of poems, Offerings for Ordinary Gods, is coming out middle of 2026, so I'm looking forward to giving that a read. There are a lot of potential podcast books for 26. I've been making a list and checking it twice and filling up all those week-by-week slots for next year and figuring out what I've got to read in time for what, so we'll see. But she's set for mid-July, so we'll see what else comes out. Now, the other thing is, this is a weird one, but yesterday, an artist friend of mine, an artist friend of my wife's actually, he sent me this long ago commission. I'd asked him to make a portrait of Montaigne and never specified payment, but, he wanted to do it for free, so whatever. I'm going to say it's like 8 or 9 years ago that I asked him to do this, and he mentioned it once or twice over the years. But yesterday, this box showed up, and lo and behold, portrait of Montaigne in a weathered gold frame. I'm going to take that as synchronicity. I think maybe it is time to return to Montaigne's essays, because before starting the podcast in 2012, I did this thing called Monday Morning Montaigne, where I blogged every single essay by Montaigne in sequence. Tried to do one every week, post them every Monday. There were a couple of lags. Some of the essays are longer than others, but whatever. That ended in 2009, and I've gone back and looked at just a couple of the essays since. That time, I read all the essays in sequence. You know me, I'm this micromanaging, overarching thinker who has to do that sort of thing. This time, I'm not gonna. I've got this book in front of me. I'd hoped to record with the translator, David Coward. It's a selection of essays by Montaigne called What Do I Know? It's from Pushkin Press. And maybe I'm just going to start there. Read some of the quote-unquote greatest hits of Montaigne, not create some giant mega project for myself, but at the same time, see how the essays have changed since I was 2009, so I was 38 when I finished that project. Surely I haven't changed at all in 16, 17 years, but the essays probably have. The words are probably rearranged. I'm going to see how Montaigne's essays and I have both changed. So that is, I think, my big aspiration for 2026 is to return to Montaigne. And that is it for the 2025 edition of the Virtual Memories Show guest list. Thank you for sticking around. Thanks for listening throughout the year. I'm very happy to have had so many great books in my life and so many creative people to talk to, and so many of them to turn me on to other books. So I hope we'll get to meet up here next year for another round of the guest list on the Virtual Memories Show. And there is the one book I did not talk about, which is Guest Host. That is my book. I'm spending too much time working on this instead of working on that. But my goal between Christmas and New Year's is to make heavy, heavy progress on that book. And I hope I get to read it next year, and I hope you do too. Thanks for listening to the Virtual Memories Show. You can support this podcast by telling other people about it. There's no better way to build an audience than through word of mouth. Also, visit Apple's podcast page for us and leave a rating and review. Every little bit helps, you know? You can also support the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it and who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or comic or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a postcard, letter, email, DM if we're connected on Instagram or Blue Sky, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. Messages can be up to 3 minutes long. It'll cut you off after that, so call back and leave another message if you do. And let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with our listeners, but I'd never run someone's message without their permission, so let me know. Now, if you've got money to spare, I appreciate it, but don't give it to me. I've got a day job that pays the bills. you should give to individuals and institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo, all those crowdfunding platforms, where you'll find people who really need help just trying to make ends meet or get an artistic project going, covering medical bills or car payments or veterinary bills, and just a few dollars from you might make a real difference in their lives. Now, when it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank and World Central Kitchen every month, but there are a lot of other things you can give to the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, Election Funds, Planned Parenthood, and Women's Choice. There's a lot of things you can do with your money to try to help build a better world, so I hope you'll give. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You can visit my archives at vmspod.com to check out my 2018 conversation with Hal, where you can learn more about his art, his music, and more. And you can follow Hal on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. That's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download all our past episodes at Apple Podcasts and other podcast sources. And you can find all my episodes and sign up for the Virtual Memories Show newsletter at vmspod.com. And I'm also on Blue Sky and Instagram and YouTube as VMSPod. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.